Helm grew fierce and gaunt for famine and grief, and the dread of him alone was worth many men in the defence of the burg. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow troll into the camps of his enemies and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon could bite on him. The Dunlending said that if he could find no food, he ate men. That tale lasted long in Dunland. Helm had a great horn, and soon it was marked that before he sallied forth, he would blow a blast of it that echoed in the deep, and then so great a fear fell on his enemies that instead of gathering to take him or kill him, they fled away down the combe. One night men heard the horn blowing, but Helm did not return. In the morning there came a sun-gleam, the first for long days, and they saw a white figure standing still on the dike, alone, for none of the Dunlendings dared come near. There stood Helm, dead as a stone, but his knees were unbent. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, the 2024 film The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, directed by Kenji Kamiyama, produced by New Line Studios, Warner Brothers Animation, and Sola Entertainment, for distribution by Warner. Our opening quote comes from the very brief textual root of this tale from the history of Rohan, Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, Annals of the Kings and Rulers, specifically the second section, focused on the House of Eorl. In this passage, we learn that Gondor's hold on the region of Calenarthon is threatened by Dunlendings in the west, the men of Dunland, the region to the west of the Misty Mountains extending from the Gate of Moria all the way down to Isengard, and orcs to the east and the north, descending from their holds within the Misty Mountains themselves. Cirion, then the steward of Gondor, sends word north to the men of the Vale of Anduin. Many ignore that call, but one man, Eorl, leads many valiant warriors south to aid their allies. The army of Gondor is embroiled in an ugly battle on the field of Celebrant when, all unlooked for, the riders of Eorl come out of the north and save the day. The battle is won, and Eorl hunts the survivors of the opposing army all across the wold and the plains of Calenarthon, and as a reward, Cirion, the steward of Gondor, gives the region in its entirety to Eorl and his people, who name it the Mark of the Riders, and take for themselves the name Eorlingas, the people of Eorl. In Gondor, they're called the Rohirrim, the people of the land of Rohan, the horse country. This all happens in the year 2510 of the Third Age, 500 years or so before the War of the Ring. And things are pretty good in Rohan for like 250 years, until in 2754 of the Third Age, when the king of the Mark, Helm Hammerhand, kills one of his vassals, a man called Freka, and exiles his son Wolf. All at once, we are on the brink of civil war. And what follows is partly a Rohirric civil war and partly a war against a Dunlending conquest of Rohan. This is what's depicted in, appropriately enough, the War of the Rohirrim. The movie was announced in 2021 as part of the 20th anniversary celebration for Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring. Philippa Boyens consults on the project, and the script is co-written by her daughter, Phoebe Gittins. Artists Alan Lee and John Howe were brought in to help realize in animation the Rohan that we are familiar with from the Jackson trilogy, and a lot is said in promotional material about how complex our hero and villain, Hèra and Wolf, are. In the end, the former turns out to be much more interesting than the latter, but hey, promotion is promotion. They also talk a lot about how much history and depth, both from Tolkien's work and from Anglo-Saxon history, are being brought to this previously underexplored part of the professor's work. The movie is initially scheduled for release in April of 2024, but is delayed because of the SAG-AFTRA strikes of 2023. In the end, the movie is released December 13th, 2024, to a resounding critical and popular shrug, dropping on home streaming services only 2 weeks after its theatrical debut. It made back an estimated $20 million of its $30 million budget at the box office, but the marketing spend was also significant, so it's very unlikely, even given its relative success on streaming platforms, that the film earned out. Whatever that means in the streaming landscape of the distant past of 2024, back when HBO Max was just called Max. That's after it was called HBO Max and before it was called HBO Max. Now, a quick note before I get into a discussion of the story of the War of the Rohirrim. I am a student of stories, a scholar to the extent that I am a scholar at all of narrative. I don't have the training, the learning, the reading to talk with authority on subjects outside of that particular domain, beyond giving judgments of, taste, opinions of the aesthetics of a given piece or its subjective quality as I respond to it. And I'm not, I have to say, schooled in animation, particularly in the Japanese tradition. I have seen, as I have said on podcasts before, more anime than someone who doesn't care about anime, but much less anime than someone who does care about anime. So I am familiar, of course, with the films of Hayao Miyazaki and the films of Satoshi Kon. I have watched Cowboy Bebop and Full Metal Alchemist, the first one, not the latter one, and Trigun. And I've tried, God knows I've tried, with Neon Genesis Evangelion. All of which is to say that I don't really have the perspective or the experience to give a thorough critique of the aesthetics of this film. I'm going to be focused on the story, but it feels disingenuous at this point not to offer like a brief opinion on the way the thing looks, which is to say, mostly very bad. Well, perhaps not very bad. Any particular still of this film, I think, looks quite good, with some genuinely outstanding moments, but the animation style is flawed to me from conception because it depends on the compositing of high frame rate modern CGI backgrounds and low frame rate hand-drawn, or I'm going to guess mostly hand-drawn animation for the characters. So the backgrounds, including the movement of the camera, are animated at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second, just like a live-action movie, while the hand-drawn elements are, as animators say, animated on 2s or 3s, which means that they're actually only 8 or 12 frames a second. When the backgrounds are still, when the notional camera isn't moving, I think this can look pretty good. But the minute that the backgrounds are moving and the characters are moving, and you have two different frame rates happening on the screen at the same time, I mean, it's not good. I could not get on with it. And this movie is long, which is a topic that we'll discuss a little later. And over that whole running length, I could not get used to how artificial it looks. Because there's a feature in early 3D video games, I'm thinking mostly of the classic 90s first-person shooter Doom here, where the technology has advanced to the point that we are capable of depicting a blocky, rectilinear 3D world that you can move through pretty freely, but the enemies within that world are still two-dimensional sprites. They're composed of pixels just like Mario, who kind of hang roughly in the 3D space, but obviously don't exist within it. They are flat creatures who are always oriented, invariably, toward the camera, billboarded, as they say. And that's exactly what I kept thinking as I was watching War of the Rohirrim. It just doesn't look good, particularly in motion. Aside from the look of the thing, we should also talk about the audio, particularly the voice acting. Mostly, I think the cast is fairly good, with a few standouts. It is really great hearing Miranda Otto again, though I will say that she isn't, I think, giving a particularly distinctive performance as Éowyn, narrating the whole piece, introducing us, and then closing out the story at the end of the movie. Gaia Wise, who plays Hèra, our heroine, is really rather good, as is Lorraine Ashbourne, who happens to be married in real life to Andy Serkis, but more importantly, plays Olwen in this film, and really comes off very well indeed. I also enjoyed Michael Wildman as Targ, who is pretty straightforward but engaging enough as a C-tier villain. The voice cameo from Christopher Lee as Saruman right at the end is honestly incredible, despite my suspicion of the circumstances of the production, which is to say that it's an unused recording from the production of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but it's still effective because it is still that Christopher Lee voice. The biggest problem in terms of the cast, I would say, is Brian Cox as Helm Hammerhand himself, giving a really uncommitted and inconsistent, kind of typically phoned-in performance. It doesn't really work, but luckily it doesn't really need to. And I guess, too, I should call out Dominic Monaghan, who gives a really surprising performance as the orc Rot, and Billy Boyd, who gives an extremely familiar performance as the orc Shank. Good to hear them nonetheless. So with all that said, what do we make of the War of the Rohirrim, this Rohirric civil war, this development of a new heroine for the world of Middle-earth, accompanied by some really big birds? We open then in Rohan, 200 years before Bilbo gets the ring, as Éowyn helpfully tells us, in what is, I think, a pretty effective voiceover. We get a version of the scene from Appendix A, more or less, in which Helm, King of Rohan, kills Freka with a single punch, earning himself the name Hammerhand. The actual event is a little different. There's a real Han Solo special edition feeling to the repositioning of Helm's violence as, in the film, a response to Freka's attack, rather than, as in the original text, a taking of the initiative. Wolf, who we already know has both a long-standing friendship with Hèra and some super creepy incel vibes, is exiled, and we cut ahead seasons, presumably matching the 4 years from the original text. We have a brief sequence in which there are spooky events out there on the plains. Hela and her cousin, the future King Freyalaf, investigate, discovering a Mumak rampaging across the countryside. Hela leads it away into the forest, where she delivers the Mumak like DoorDash to a hungry watcher in the water who has a fancy hat made out of leaves. And if there is a moment when my heart sinks, then it is that moment, because what I have just said is literally true, right? Hèra is then captured by Targ and taken to Isengard, which Wulf has taken over with his army of Dunlendings ahead of an all-out assault on Edoras. Hèra escapes with the aid of Freylaf and her aunt/maid/shield maiden mentor Olwen, and that is basically our first act. And a lot of the problems in this film are present in that first act. I understand how tempting it is to have an extended action sequence early in the story, and I certainly understand the temptation to include a watcher in the water because, I mean, as I've said before, I am fascinated by those parts of Tolkien's Legendarium, and if I were to write Tolkien fanfic with a $30 million budget, I'd probably be tempted to include the Watcher in the water too. But see, that's part of the problem right there, because I think of the Watcher in the water rather than a Watcher in the water. The larger problem is that all of these elements feel disconnected from each other. This is a story on the sharp edge of history. This is about old grudges and new pride compounded by time, building under pressure until there is an explosion within Rohirric culture. That's why we start with Freka's death and Wulf's exile, because everything that happens is in part a consequence of that moment, a consequence of Helm's arrogance. The entirety of the narrative as it's presented in the original text is this, quote, "At the same time, Rohan was again invaded from the east, and the Dunlending senior chants came over the Isen and down from Isengard." End quote. And I guess that we have established Mumakil, Oliphants, right, as being representative of the armies of the Easterlings, but a Mumak and a forest monster don't, to me, communicate the kind of military pressure that the book suggests. There's some brief lip service paid here to the idea of Southrons and this building army campfires on the horizon, but it doesn't all connect. Things do pick up a little when Hèra is captured and taken to Isengard in the second half of the first act, and the encampment of the Dunlending army is realized because we're immediately back on much firmer ground. The structure of the next act is also, I think, pretty solid. Freylaf counsels caution and care, so Helm exiles him too and leads his forces to war, not knowing that he has been betrayed by his vassal Lord Thorn. When the army takes the field, these glimmering campfires on the plain visible from Edoras, Hèra realizes that Lord Thorn isn't trustworthy and takes command, ordering the evacuation of Edoras and a retreat to the Hornburg, setting the stage for the climax of our story. One of the clearest connections between the Jackson trilogies and this movie, besides the design work for the Rohirrim, is that we get exactly the same kind of bewildering geography, where every important location is right next door to every other location, and distance just doesn't matter. Hèra gets from Isengard to Edoras in hours, more than once, in fact. Then Helm is told that the Dunlending army is only 20 leagues away and will therefore attack that night, but 20 leagues is 60 miles, and it's already the middle of the day, which means one of two things: that this ragtag army is maintaining at least double the pace set by Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas when they are crossing Rohan in the Two Towers, or, alternatively, that nobody involved in the production checked how far a league is. I'll also note that it's really too bad that Hèra's great moment of insight, of leadership here, is precipitated by a moment of forced ignorance. When she's in Isengard, she sees the correspondence between Thorn and Wulf, sealed with Thorn's mark, but she doesn't recognize it, despite Thorn being one of her father's most trusted vassals. She needs the Meriadic Brandybuck stand-in character Leaf to explain it for her, which is really just too bad. So we wind up eventually at the heart of this particular story, with the Rohirrim of Helm besieged in the Hornburg by Wulf's forces. Halath and Hama, Hèra's brothers, are killed. Helm becomes less and less suited to leadership, sneaking out of safety to predate upon enemies in the mountains. Hèra goes out one night and finds him, which is where we get the scene of Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, Merry and Pippin from the original trilogy, as a pair of orcs collecting rings from the fallen on the orders of their master, which works fairly well for me. And there's a fight scene with a snow troll that, may or may not be an externalization of Helm's grief and desperation and battle fury. But then we return to the front gate of the Hornburg, only to seemingly realize that he's doing more harm than good to his people, and so consumed by his grief, he battles Wulf's men on the causeway, freezing in place through the dread frigidity of the night, still on his feet, as in our opening quote. And all of that, I think, is really quite good. I do think that Helm's final moments do a lot to redeem my appreciation of his character earlier in the story. This leaves Hèra in command, though the circumstance is dire, and we move into what I think is a pretty solid final act, where we draw all the elements of the plot together, both literally and symbolically. Hèra goes and communes with the great eagles and gains their help. She then, loaded with symbolic meaning, puts on a wedding dress and goes to fight Wulf one-on-one in order to buy time for her people to escape and for Freyalaf, her cousin, to possibly arrive with reinforcements. And honestly, the fight scene with Wulf is pretty good. There is an egregious fake-out when it seems as though Hèra has been stabbed, only to cut to the reverse angle and to show that she has instead caught Wulf's wrist and is actually fine. The design of her Bride of Death outfit is incompatible with the general look and feel of the Rohirrim as established in the movies, this Anglo-Saxon style, but all of her costuming is incompatible with the look of the Rohirrim per the movies. But because it is supposed to be theatrical in fiction, here at the end of the story, it comes off as looking less like a character design from a Final Fantasy video game, less that than her thigh-high boots and jacket that falls like a miniskirt ensemble from earlier in the film, at least. In the end, the good guys save the day. Hèra kills Wulf, Freyalaf takes the throne, and we clear up the outstanding business with two brief scenes. A fleeting introduction of Saruman, who's good enough to take over Isengard and will, I'm sure, be a strong ally in the times to come, and Hèra going off with Olwen into the wide world, beginning with an appointment to go meet Gandalf. Having both of these moments maybe feels a little heavy-handed, but I understand that that is part of the deal with a movie like this. If I had to keep one and lose the other, it's really hard to decide. It's really hard to decide. Because one thing that does work here for me, and has irritated other critics and scholars, is that the movie offers Hèra pretty early in its movement a choice of two fates, very common to the kinds of female characters who end up in situations like this. She should either marry Freyaluf, who seems like a good dude for all that they're first cousins, and in so doing cement the hold of the royal line on the throne of Rohan. This is her duty, right? Alternatively, and the movie seems to be swinging for this throughout the last act, Hèra should die heroically, saving her people, but avoiding the oppressive domestic drudgery of being queen. Certainly, her whole betrothal to death at the end of the film seems to be setting the stage for exactly this outcome, which then gives strength, support to the fate of her death at the hands of Wulf. But this is Hèra's story, and Hèra gets to choose. So she chooses neither of the options presented her by the men in her life, and instead goes off on her own to be free to hang out with Gandalf and have adventures. A recurring theme here on Shire Reckoning is that I am all in favor of people hanging out with Gandalf and having adventures. Hèra rejects the false dichotomy of obedience on one hand and glorious heroic punishment for disobedience on the other, and instead takes her life, not just her death, for her own. It's the kind of heroism, by the way, of which Éowyn would be proud, and I see it as a very similar fate to the one that Éowyn gets at the end of her story. She chooses Faramir and life in Ithilien rather than either of the options, throne or death, offered her by her people, by her brother, by her king, before the War of the Ring. It does present a weird detail when it comes to the textual history of this story, which Éowyn even introduces by saying, quote, "By her hand many great deeds were done, but do not look for tales of her in the old songs. There are none." End quote. Which forces us to ask, then what is this film? What is this story which Éowyn is telling to an unseen audience? Is this some kind of privileged information? Some story only passed from mother to daughter, from shield maiden to shield maiden? We don't, unfortunately, have an answer as to where this story comes from, which is perhaps the most un-Tolkienian thing in the entire movie. So, in conclusion, there are things to like about War of the Rohirrim, and there are things which definitely don't work. The idea of shield maidens existing as a culture inside of Rohan, a kind of defined sorority of warrior women, is a fairly interesting one, but nothing is really done with it, and it does, of course, inevitably detract a little from Éowyn's story in the original trilogy. Siege stories also only work if you have a strong sense of time and space, so that you can constantly build the pressure. But this movie has neither. It isn't at all clear how the various spaces within and beyond the Hornburg connect to each other, or how long anything has taken or will take. I do think that Hèra is genuinely great, as is Olwen, as is Freyalaf. I don't have a lot of use for Haleth, Hèra's elder brother, but Hama, the sensitive boy with his lyre or harp, is underused but very strong, honestly. More than anything, though, this film communicates something very clear that will be important for anyone seeking to adapt Tolkien in the future, particularly if we're trying to maintain tonal compatibility with the Jackson series. This movie, like all the others in the series, works best when it is on the ground, when it is focused on the experience of individuals, when our perspective on the world around us is limited and incomplete, when the events around us feel as though they have a life of their own that we cannot fully comprehend. The Watcher in the Water is stronger and better and more frightening because we don't see it. The Battle of Helm's Deep works best because we are behind those walls. We are feeling the cold stone and the hopelessness of the dark night beyond. Tolkien understood that we need to begin and largely remain connected to the physical reality of this world, or we can have no sense of scale, no sense of wonder, of desperation and defiance and hope. And War of the Rohirrim, like the latter Hobbit films, is too tempted by spectacle to keep its feet on the ground. This week, I was fortunate enough to receive a really interesting question from a brand new listener, Simon, who asks, quote, "Picking up on the subject of adaptation from last week, I have a question and a comment. The comment is that I hate Tauriel, not because she isn't true to the books, but I think the writing and the performance are bad. Like they started with the idea of a hot girl superhero and didn't develop her any further than that. For my question, is there a way to bring more gender diversity into future adaptations of Tolkien's work, or are we doomed to add characters like Tauriel to the next version and the next of The Lord of the Rings?" End quote. Simon, you are not the only person I've heard express exactly that opinion on Tauriel. I think that I've hinted before that I don't completely share that interpretation myself. I think that judging on a Hobbit movie trilogy curve, Tauriel actually gets more development and complexity than we might expect. Contrast her to I don't know, Dian, for example, right? Though, yes, I will admit that she doesn't hit quite as well, quite as hard as she should. But I do think you've got something with regard to your larger point. Duct taping new characters to the side of a Tolkien story isn't necessarily going to be a good or sustainable way of adding some much-needed diversity into future adaptations. But there are other approaches, rooted in a love of the legendarium and, most importantly, some very careful reading of the text. The first, and the most obvious, rests in the highlighting of characters who are just under the surface or just to the side of the core text. We can pull out their stories, put them center stage. Eorith, for example, right, the healer in Minas Tirith who says, "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer," is a great character who is barely explored in the text as we have it. Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel, the wife of Elrond, the mother of Arwen, would be so interesting. Arwen herself, come to that, who is perhaps the most conspicuously absent character in the entire Legendarium. Goldberry, for goodness sake, right? There are a handful of female characters who could use some more attention, and many more female characters who exist only by implication and can be freely explored. But that, honestly, can only take you so far, which leads us to the second approach, which is more complex, more challenging, more controversial, but arguably more rewarding. Because Tolkien has some things to say about gender, race, and identity. And those things, when he says them, are generally interesting. They're inextricable from the text. They need to be there and should obviously be preserved. But the problem is that when Tolkien isn't deliberately saying something about gender or race or identity, he defaults to this kind of early 20th century societal structure that doesn't have any narrative significance or content. It's just a world filled with cishet dudes because that's the world that Tolkien inhabited most fully. Thorin Oakenshield, for example, is specific and intentional in terms of his dwarvishness and his masculinity. These things are inextricable from who Thorin is on the page. But Barlaam Butterbur, to pick a random example, could be anyone and fulfill exactly the same narrative role. Belinda Butterbur, owner of the Prancing Pony, adds diversity, but doesn't subtract anything of substance. We add a female character with position and with influence, and we lose nothing, which is a step toward good adaptation. Obviously, Butterbur is a very minor character, and we want to be more bold in our adaptation than that. So let's consider, as a thought experiment, the Fellowship itself. Who in the Fellowship is defined by the foundations of their identity, and who isn't? And how do these choices ripple out in terms of how we understand the text? For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be falling back on a gender binary kind of shorthand, but we needn't be so completely definitive about it, and we can absolutely acknowledge the existence of a broad spectrum. I'm also not going to be talking about race per the Tolkien meaning of the word, because the members of the Fellowship actually are intentionally defined by their fantasy race, right? It is important that Legolas is an elf. It is important that Gimli is a dwarf. In terms of real-life ethnicity when it comes to casting, well, casting and production, I think, is another conversation that we can have at another time. I would certainly be inclined to include as diverse a cast as possible. Similarly, I'm going to be largely dismissive of questions of sexuality because this is Professor Tolkien's work, so we're not going to be spending a lot of time on romance. And if we do, we're largely going to be running the risk of, as I said, duct taping extra elements onto the side of the existing story. So we're largely, as we approach this question of diversity, going to be thinking about gender, but those speculations are inevitably going to touch on other parts of identity too. For example, I would argue that neither Frodo nor Sam is necessarily masculine, by which I mean that their gender identity isn't an inextricable part of their overall Frodoness or Samness. So we could easily gender flip one or the other, but the problem with doing so, in an age of what Adrian Rich called compulsory heterosexuality, is that their very intimate and powerful friendship would inevitably turn into a kind of sublimated romantic or sexual desire. And that, I think, is explicitly against what Tolkien intended with their story. And that's part of the process of adaptation, not just considering each individual point, but looking at how those points work together. So let's do some quick filtering here of the Fellowship. Aragorn and Boromir are both actually somewhat defined by their masculinity, particularly in contrast to the one with the other. So I don't think that we can change them and preserve their storylines unaltered. But Legolas? Gimli? Well, again, just like Frodo and Sam, I wouldn't want to make Legolas Legolas, because of the same cultural inclination to read their friendship then as being romantic or sexual, also against Tolkien's intent. So the answer might be to flip both Legolas and Gimli. It's something to think about, at least, and I cannot think of an immediate argument against that strategy. That takes us on to Merry and Pippin, and one of those two, I think, is a very good candidate. I'd hesitate to make Merry a female hobbit because of the inevitable girl power overtones of the Éowyn story, right, and the death of the Witch King of Angmar, although it does help resolve the prophecy in a really interesting way. That's a provocative thought. But Pippin, I think, could work really well. I wouldn't probably change both Merry and Pippin because of the implications of then splitting the party along gender lines at Parth Galen, particularly if Frodo and Sam are both male. I'm not sure exactly how that would play out. But we might imagine, and forgive me, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this, so please do take it with a grain of salt and forgive any problems that I have overlooked here. But if we consider Legolas, Gimli, and Pippin, then we've already got 30% gender diversity in the Fellowship without, I think, losing a thing. Except for the inviting of exhausting online arguments about female dwarves and what Tolkien did or did not intend. But listen, we can't let the worst elements in the fandom dictate what is or is not acceptable in adaptation, or we will wind up like Star Wars. So Legolas, Gimli, Peregrine, arguably both Frodo and Sam, leaving only Aragorn, Boromir, and Merry as being necessarily male. Aragorn and Boromir because it is, I think, part of their story, and Merry because of the Éowyn plot. And we can go beyond just the Fellowship. We can't really touch the Rohirrim because of that Éowyn story too, right? Which depends upon her being exceptional. But Faramir? There's some interesting implications about his role as a model of positive masculinity that I would have to think through. So Denethor might be a better, more interesting idea. Provide more counterpoint with Theoden too. And now I have reached the part of the show where I am just thinking out loud. So I might as well take this discussion to social media and invite all of your contributions. Who would work? Who wouldn't? Is this the best way to approach diversity in the story? You can find Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and, much better, Blue Sky, and you can subscribe on YouTube and leave a comment there. Why don't you? Or you can email me directly at shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. Thank you for the question, Simon. Thank you for listening, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you think. Last week, I asked about the parts of the Legendarium that we'd like to see adapted, and the resounding winner was Beren and Luthien, though most of you were of the opinion that it would be better in the context of a full Silmarillion TV show or movie universe. So let no one say that we are not ambitious. I'm actually rather charmed by the idea of conceiving an interconnected web of movies as being a functional platform for the Silmarillion project. I'm going to give some more thought to that and possibly return to it in the future. This week in our Almanac of Arda, has only one major event, I'm afraid. The parting of the company returning north from the War of the Ring as Celeborn and Galadriel take the Redhorn Pass over the Misty Mountains and head back to Lothlorien, while everyone else, basically the hobbits and Gandalf and Elrond and his retinue, continue on toward Rivendell. Next week, though, we will have some really interesting events to look forward to in our Almanac of Arda, and then the following week, everything kicks off for real, and this turns into a real segment right here on Shire Reckoning. In the real world, September 8th is the birthday of Martin Freeman, who manages to be a genuinely excellent Bilbo Baggins throughout the entire Hobbit trilogy. September 9th is the birthday of both illustrator Pauline Baynes, who unfortunately passed in 2008, and scholar Tom Shippey, who is a hale and hearty 82 years old. The 10th of September marks the 68th anniversary of Tolkien winning the International Fantasy Award in 1957, and September 12th is the birthday of Ian Holm, perhaps the most influential Bilbo Baggins, apologies to Martin Freeman, who sadly passed in 2020. In terms of scholarship and community this week, we've got a lot. Because On the Trail at the Tolkien Collector's Guide has kind of done my job for me by compiling a huge list of all the available journals and blogs and wikis and podcasts relating to Tolkienalia, which will certainly keep you busy until the next episode of Shire Reckoning, if not beyond. And if that doesn't completely fill your schedule for the next week, the Mythopoetic Society has just released all of their panels and talks from their online midsummer seminar, More Perilous and Fair, Women and Gender in Mythopoetic Fantasy, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the publication of Perilous and Fair, Women in the Works and Life of J.R.R. Tolkien. I haven't had a chance yet to sit down and watch any of them, but I am really looking forward to them, particularly the 2 videos dedicated to Arathel, the mother of Maiglin, who is a completely fascinating character, just there in the periphery of the Silmarillion. I'm sure that I will call out some specific videos over the course of the next few weeks as I catch up with them. Simon, who sent in our question this week, also recommended the blog of historian Brett Devereaux, who posts a lot about Tolkien, including some really interesting historical nitpicks of the Rings of Power. He's a really engaging writer. I recommend the whole thing. You can find that link in the show notes too. And lastly, the Thoughts on Tolkien blog, posted just this morning as of this recording, a really thoughtful analysis of where Éowyn comes from in the textual history and in terms of Tolkien's inspiration, a really great accompaniment to the War of the Rohirrim. And that is going to do it for this week here on Shire Reckoning. Join me Tuesday evening to make it all the way into the wild and to seek shelter in the House of Beorn in Chapter 7 of The Hobbit, Queer Lodgings, as we talk about the importance of storytelling within the Legendarium. You can find the link to the live session by following the Patreon page at patreon.com/nextword, where conveniently enough, you can also sign up to send me the price of a cup of coffee every month to help me invest in equipment and pay for the podcast and devote even more time to making these shows all they can be. I would also please request that you take some time this week to leave a rating or leave a review, or better yet, tell a human being in your life about this podcast that you listen to, and maybe chat a little with them about the War of the Rohirrim. That'll do it for another Sunday. Thank you all so much for listening and for all your correspondence. Until next time, Aure in Taluva.